Alright, if you're looking to take a picture that looks like this one, or maybe this one, then you click on the right video. In today's video, I'm gonna teach you how to take long exposure pictures with your Fujifilm camera. First, let's talk about what is long exposure. Shooting long exposure is basically taking a picture while increasing your shutter speed duration. Your shutter speed is basically the speed at which your shutter will close, and also the amount of time that the light will reach your sensor. So shooting long exposure means that you will increase that amount of time, which will basically result in blurred movement. And those movements can be anything: light from cars, water from waterfall or the sea, people, or any other subject with movement that you want to capture. Before we dive in the settings that you need, let's first talk about what you will need to shoot long exposure. If you're watching this video, I assume that you already have a camera. Personally, I use the Fujifilm X-T4, and I will use this camera to demonstrate how to do the settings in this video. The second thing that you will need is a tripod. The reason why you want to have a tripod to shoot long exposure is that you need a steady camera. Because you increase the amount of time that your shutter will be open and the amount of time that the light will reach your sensor, any small movement while holding your camera will affect the sharpness of your picture. In order to remove all those small movements and those problems of sharpness in your picture, just set your camera on a tripod. And if you don't have a tripod, that's okay. Just set your camera somewhere steady, for example, on a wall or on a table. And finally, you will also need a variable ND filter. An ND filter is basically a piece of glass that acts as a sunglass for your lens. It will reduce the amount of light reaching your sensor and allow you to basically increase the duration that the light reaches your sensor while maintaining a correct exposure. Personally, I use this variable ND filter from Earth. Check out the link in the description if you want to know more. Alright, so now that we know everything that we need, the next thing that I want you to care about is your composition. Before even diving into the settings, set your tripod and the camera until you're satisfied with your composition. That is true for long exposure shots, but also for pretty much any kind of shot out there. Composition is key, and you will always want to adjust your composition first before diving into any setting. So now when it comes to setting, the first thing I want you to do is to disable IBIS or OIS on your camera. And the reason why you want to disable it is to make sure that the camera doesn't try to compensate for small movement while being on a tripod, because it's already stable enough. So make sure you just disable it to have the sharpest image possible. To disable IBIS in your camera, press the menu button, select shooting setting, scroll down to IS mode, and make sure that it's selected to off. One more thing that I would advise you to enable is the self-timer. When you press the shutter of your camera, you basically induce small movements within your tripod, right? When it comes to long exposure, those movements will not be compensated by a fast shutter speed. So enable the self-timer to make sure that you have some time between the moment you press the shutter and the moment where your camera starts capturing the light, reaching its sensor. To enable self-timer in your camera, press the menu button, select shooting setting, scroll down to self-timer, and select 2 seconds. Alright, so now let's dive into the exposure triangle. So first, I want you to set your ISO to its minimum value. Basically, right now you're trying to shoot long exposure shots, so we can assume that you will have a shutter speed that is slow enough so that you don't have to increase your ISO to compensate for low light. So set your ISO to its minimum value. In my case, on the X-T4, it is at 160. And now let's move on to the next component of the exposure triangle, which is your aperture. Now your aperture will completely depend on what you're trying to photograph, the depth of field that you want, and your composition. Set your aperture based on what you want to do. For example, if you're trying to capture landscape, I would suggest 5.6 to f11. But if you want a shallower depth of field, that is up to you. That is up to what you want to create. And finally, it's time to set our shutter speed. Now, as you can see on your Fujifilm camera, your shutter speed dial is marked from 1 to 8000, which basically corresponds to 1/8000 of a second to 1 second. Now, if you want to reach a shutter speed that is longer than a second, you will have to set your shutter speed dial to the T position. Then you can adjust your shutter speed using the back dial. Now, when it comes to the shutter speed value that you should choose, I could spend one entire video of 1 or 2 hours describing all the possible shutter speed that you should use in that or this case, right? However, I don't feel like this would be extremely productive, so I basically created a small document that will give you some guidelines on what shutter speed to use based on the effect that you want to create. So check out the link in the description, click on it, and you will have all the shutter speed value that you can use based on the case of what you're shooting. However, remember that those are guidelines and guidelines only. You should try to experiment and see what effect you want to produce and select the best shutter speed for that effect. Alright, so once your shutter speed, your ISO and your aperture are set, you might not have a correct exposure. You might be over or underexposed. It's time now to use your variable ND filter. First, I want you to enable the histogram display on your Fujifilm camera to make sure that you will have the correct exposure. To enable the display of the diagram on your screen, press the menu button, go to Setting, Screen Setting, scroll down to Display Custom Setting, and make sure that the histogram is enabled. Once it is enabled, turn your ND filter left and right to try to expose your image correctly. You will know that your image is exposed correctly once there is no data on the far left or on the far right of your histogram, which basically represent all the data that is captured on your sensor from the shadows to the highlights. Alright, so now we are done with the settings. So what I want you to do is basically press the shutter, wait for the self-timer to time out, try not to move your camera, and wait for your camera to acquire the image. If you're satisfied with the image produced by your camera, then you're pretty much done. However, if you're not satisfied with what you created, then I invite you to change your shutter speed, slower shutter speed for more blur, and faster shutter speed for less blur, and then readjust your setting accordingly. Remember that at the end of the day, it's all about experimenting and see what works for you. Alright, so let me know if you have any question down in the comment. And now that you understand long exposure, you might want to check this video right here where I teach you more about exposure in general and the exposure triangle on your Fujifilm camera. See you there.